In the 21st century, those who change the world are those who change the culture. They get people in sync, lead tribes, create movements, and generate an energy field where ordinary people achieve extraordinary results.
As humans, of course, we know we can do great things. We can operate on amazing purpose and create legacy and contribution and create great objectives and then go and achieve them. We can do all of that, but we're going to be constantly struggling with what I call now the fear algorithm, which is scanning the horizon just underneath the surface of our consciousness and is very fast acting, scanning the horizon for risk and uncertainty. And its job, its evolutionarily brilliant bonus that it brings us, and it is a bonus, is to protect us very quickly from risk and uncertainty, way faster than before our conscious brain can get involved. Our goal-setting contribution brain can get involved. So we live in this tension between, I want to move forward, do great things, create contribution, legacy, and hit objectives, and a big parachute pulling behind us that is called risk and uncertainty and the fear algorithm. The fear algorithm fires off into the limbic system at incredible speed. So we're getting a physiological change, a chemical change, different regions of the brain taking over our cognition. All of that's happening involuntarily unless we're trained in how to deal with it.
I'm Bajer, and this is the Culture Lab podcast, where you will find ideas and inspiration on how to harness the power of team and organizational culture. I talk to leadership thinkers, culture experts, entrepreneurs, and all sorts of movers and shakers, and together we explore the fascinating topic of culture, leadership, and personal growth. If you like what you hear, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Or better yet, write a review on iTunes and share the podcast with your followers and friends on social media. For more, check out our archive at www.agabajer.com/podcast. Hello and welcome to episode 47. My guest today is Jim Lawless. He's a leading authority on what he calls AQ, developing organizational adaptability skills to deliver bold, fast change. Jim works with senior leaders to build cultures that can adapt and deliver. According to his bio, he has inspired and educated over 500,000 people on 5 continents, both through his keynotes and his best-selling book, Taming Tigers. And I can certainly confirm that his book has been an inspiration for my husband for sure, because he set a really unreasonable goal when it comes to his athletic endeavors. And, I'm not the one to announce what the goal is, but when he's ready to reveal it to the world, I'll let you guys know. I wanted to interview Jim because fear has been one of the most consistent themes on this podcast. 50 interviews now, and it has come up again and again and again. It prevents us from standing out and leading change, and also doesn't allow people to be as open to change as we'd like them to be. Plus, it's completely impossible to have an adaptive culture when fear runs wild. So Jim and I have a wide-ranging conversation from the impact that our fear algorithm has on our ability to achieve bold change to simple things, but still challenging, like making space on our calendars for change to take place. So with no further ado, here is Jim Lawless. Jim, welcome to Culture Lab. I'm delighted to have you with us.
Thank you, Aga, and it's wonderful to be here.
Yes, and we were introduced by a common friend, Maria Papacosta, and she's such a wonderful person, and I really trust her judgment, and she was so enthusiastic about you. I said, definitely, let's book Jim. I'm not even going to look at his website because I haven't heard of you. So I was delighted to be introduced to you and your work because then I got your book and I saw some of your talks, and I really find your work fascinating. But some of our listeners might not know you yet. So I'd like to ask you to briefly introduce yourself to our listeners.
Yes, of course. I am Jim Lawless. I started my professional career as a corporate lawyer working in the City of London. I left, did my own initial huge change, which was very personally challenging, and through a circuitous route, ended up in working in change, which is a world I've worked in for the last 20 years. And my particular fascination is how we as individuals change our thinking, to change our actions, to change our results. And my other fascination is how we can simplify that and make it workable, because I think we've made it into this hugely complex thing. I now generally work through live events and masterclasses and workshops at live events designed to create immediate changes in behavior and decision making in the team as soon as they leave. And I very rarely these days get involved in large scale cultural change. I will get involved in working, for example, with the executive team to facilitate them to agree and stick to their changes as part of that. So I'll get pulled in on those two levels.
It's fascinating. So I'm really curious to learn more about this career transition. And I'm sure that you get that a lot, but I have to ask this question. What was it like to practice law with your name? Because your surname is Lawless. did you get a lot of comments on that?
When I was at university studying, I spent my holidays working as a lowly clerk with a criminal legal aid practice in London. So I would be sent off to all of London's most grim prisons to take statements from people who were waiting for their trials. And as I presented my letter of introduction at the gate, which you had to do in those pre-digital days, the reaction from the guards was just complete hilarity. And so I expected the same would happen when I walked into the City of London, but everyone was too busy to notice my name. So, but prison guards, they loved it.
I love that. It tells you something about the corporate world and then the world of law. Because
we're off, doesn't it?
So let's circle back to that career transition and what happened afterwards. But before we do that, I want us to talk a little bit about your childhood and the early years in your life, because I'm curious, what were the early cultural influences? So what made Jim, in other words?
Wow. Okay, cut that short. So I grew up in a family where an immigrant family from Ireland who had come to Ireland. My mother was born in the UK to Irish parents, and my father had travelled himself. All were economic migrants. All had come during a period of no dogs, no blacks, no Irish. All the, input for all the right reasons to us as children was succeed at school and get a job in this scary country where you don't really belong and you're not quite good enough. I think was an underlying message, and that for me meant I locked into trying hard at academia and did reasonably well in a comprehensive school in South London, and ended up at Manchester University reading law, because in my world it was lawyer, doctor, accountant, and I didn't fancy the latter two. So I went down that route. And ended up as a corporate lawyer, which we've touched.
Yeah. So fast forward from that moment, eventually you became the first Briton to dive deeper than 100 meters on a single breath.
Yeah, I didn't do that when I was.
So that happened later, and you broke that record from what I know from our research after just 8 months of training. You also became a televised jockey in just 12 months, and at the outset of that, you were 36. You had zero experience in horse riding, as far as I understand. You were unfit, and these are your words, overweight, and you couldn't take time off work to train for the race. So now I'm sure that there is a really good backstory on how you reached that decision to do those things, right? And also how you decided to leave law. So please tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, there's lots in there. So it's probably even worse than you've outlined. I was never to be found without a packet of Marlboro Light in my pocket, and I would be on my way to drink a beer every evening in those days. And so it was a big it was a big shift. Shall I start with law and then go to racing? The legal shift was terrifying. I was late 20s, so grown up but still very young, and I was clearly upsetting my family, and I didn't have a very clear route of how this was going to shape out. There was a degree of uncertainty. So that was a really difficult change. And I had two big problems with it. One was economic. How was I going to feed myself? And my second change, and would I be able to? And my second problem was my own development, self-esteem issues, which I now had to go into a party and I couldn't say, yeah, I'm a lawyer and the city. I had to be me, and that was a whole stripping exercise and ego meeting period in my life, which was very fascinating. But it was right for me. There was a lot of discomfort in the role for me. It was in the wrong place. Wonderful role, but not for me. So that was an important change to make, and that taught me a lot about change. That was my initial introduction, and made me initially fascinated with the process. The jockey adventure came out of a conversation with a client, which led to a bet where he was asking me to put my money where my mouth was. He was a senior person within BT, British Telecom, and with whom I was working on a large change program. I was talking about this framework for change, which became Taming Tigers. He challenged it and said, well, you're quite short, do this. He was clear. He's a mixture of, he was a nice guy and a very smart guy, but it was a mixture of mocking me and poking a bit of fun at the external guy, both of which I kind of understood. And so I took the challenge, knowing nothing about it. So getting into Google was a bit of an eye opener. And I think I'd been racing once in my life, no interest. Racing once, it was corporate hospitality. And to the best of my recollection, which is hazy, nobody in the group saw any horses that day. So I did nothing. And the challenge came from there. But it was deploying, using, and attempting to prove and provide credibility to a framework for personal large-scale change.
So you decided to drink your own medicine in a way, right? And demonstrate that the framework that you've developed, it can work in other areas of people's lives, not just in the corporate world.
Yeah, well, that it worked. I mean, it worked at all. I think there are a lot of people with flip charts and pens telling us what we should do. Have they, even if you go, I won't name names, but even if you got to a global stratospheric level of multi-million pound charging individuals, you have to ask, well, where's the evidence from other people or from yourself? So it was very important to me to be standing from a position of integrity and credibility. And whilst horse racing is utterly irrelevant, the speed and level, so bold, fast change is what interests me. The speed and level of the change was undeniable. And it's just an adaptation. It was just changing decisions to change actions to change results. It's all at its base level.
So you said that this journey has taught you a lot about change and speed and level of change. So definitely want to talk more about that. But first, I want your take on why would you say change is so difficult for most people? What are the reasons?
So if we take away all the mystique and boil it down, we change our actions to change our results. That means we do something new. And all of cultural change is designed to help many people do something new, change the way we do things around here. And if we're going to do something new as humans, we're going to face a degree of uncertainty because we haven't done it before. And that will bring a degree of risk. And we may get time to talk about what those risks are, because we really need to understand this, I believe, as a core professional skill now. So if we're going to go to a place of uncertainty and risk, what level of experience have we got in handling or managing that? I mean, when I went to school, I don't know about you, I was never waved off by my parents in the morning with a cheery, bye-bye, Jim, have a wonderful day at school today. Be sure and take a risk or two. Make sure that
doesn't happen, no.
Innovative way of looking at that problem from a different, and that wasn't there. Don't worry if you get a few red crosses, it shows you're pushing the boundary. We never got that. We were all, and I think, I've got two daughters, one's 22 and one's 5, and I don't think much has changed, frankly. You could argue it's got worse. We were all prepared to survive in the industrial age. And when we're trying to operate in an extremely disruptive, volatile, uncertain 21st century, whatever history will give it its title in time, whatever age we're truly in now. And that is placing a huge strain on us because we weren't trained or given the right data, which I'll return to, in our decision-making processes to enable us to look at this challenge healthily. So we're coming to a place of uncertainty and risk with no training for it. To me, that's without some understanding. Now, as humans, of course, we know we can do great things. We can operate on amazing purpose and create legacy and contribution and create great objectives and then go and achieve them. We can do all of that, but we're going to be constantly struggling with what I call now the fear algorithm, which is scanning the horizon just underneath the surface of our consciousness and is very fast acting, scanning the horizon for risk and uncertainty. And its job, its evolutionarily brilliant bonus that it brings us, and it is a bonus, is to protect us very quickly from risk and uncertainty, way faster than before our conscious brain can get involved. Our goal-setting contribution brain can get involved. So we live in this tension between, I want to move forward, do great things, create contribution, legacy, and hit objectives, and a big parachute pulling behind us that is called risk and uncertainty and the fear algorithm. The fear algorithm fires off into the limbic system at incredible speed. So we're getting a physiological change, a chemical change, different regions of the brain taking over our cognition. All of that's happening involuntarily unless we're trained in how to deal with it. And so we can attack this in two ways: help people to understand the process and the metacognition, and help them evaluate the data which they're using to perceive the world around them and perceive risk differently. And when we come to culture change, the leaders and the cultural changers can make a massive impact in terms of understanding the data. Is it risky or not? Mm-hmm. And now we're into wonderful worlds of psychological safety. But I'll let you take it where you want to go from there.
Yeah, so this is really fascinating because I've discovered in my own work around cultivating a healthy culture that actually usually what leads to toxic or maladaptive cultures is fear. So it's interesting that you are coming at this from a completely different perspective, but arriving at the same conclusion, basically, that the reason that we cannot deal with these challenges and the reason that it's so difficult to bring about change is that we are often driven and paralyzed by fear. And I completely hear you about the role of the leaders to help people overcome that. And I definitely want us to go there and explore that, because a lot of our listeners listen to the podcast exactly for that reason. So they want to find out, what is it that I can do to help my team members to embrace change and start experimenting with the different ways of doing things. Sure. So let's go there. But before we do, just in building the context for our people, and after reading your book, you talk, and I found this very, very interesting in this context of change and taking a decision to do something differently. You talk about things that are major obstacles, and one of those obstacles is that unwritten rule book that lays out what is and what is not possible for us. And I heard you say in one of your interviews that this rule book is a work of fiction until we test it. So in the context of the organizational life and in the context of culture and culture evolution, could you tell us what's your view on how we need to test it, why we need to test it first, and then what are the best ways to do it?
So this is critical, because now we're talking about perception, and I called it a rule book in Taming Tigers. I'm calling it more data now in the algorithm in the discussions now, but it doesn't matter. It's the same concept. You could call it our beliefs. And then, of course, we'll have shared beliefs and cultural beliefs that will come into, and the leaders and the primary purpose of our conversation, I guess, is to move towards that. But change will always happen at a cellular level, in individuals. We're always trying, when we're talking about, I don't like talking about, but in the olden days when we talked about cheese moving and platforms burning, we were always trying to get individuals rather coarsely to feel scared enough to try and do something new and manipulate behavior. We can do it slightly more interestingly these days. We're trying to change that perception of is it safe to be here? The rule book we have, the perceptions we have, the beliefs, the data in the algorithm, call it as you will, is how we operate. Sets the parameters within which we operate day to day. So in the industrial age, it was very high risk to be a tall poppy, as we would say in the UK, or put your head above the parapet, to stand out from the crowd. Our job was to blend into the corporate machine, do our bit, and hope somebody noticed our contribution at some stage and gave us a promotion or a pay rise, whatever that. So now we're saying to people, please come forward, please bring your personality to work, please bring your decision-making faculties to work and your education and everything that we loved about you when we hired you. Could you contribute that? And most people are saying, well, I'd really rather not. And that's, you might challenge that, and people listening might be very offended by that. But my brief over 100 times a year across the planet is we've tried so hard to bring people forward, to bring the personality, to take some risks, to own it, to make some exciting things happen, and nothing happens. Now, I'm not putting all of that blame, by the way, or accountability for that on the shoulders of the people that eventually get to hear me speak, because the leaders may have said that and then countered that message very succinctly with their own behavior. So there's a very complex thing that we're dealing with. But that rule book is clear. Now, you spoke about why should we test it and how do we test it? The reason why we have to test it is that this is where all of human growth comes from. This is how we move forward. And it's certainly how we create change in ourselves for our own careers, just keeping it at work. Many other areas of life are important too. And how we're going to move as an organization by changing those rules collectively. If we can't change the rules, the data, and test it, we can't change. We can't move with the environment around us. Example of how we can test that. So that industrial age rule might be bosses are dangerous. That's my data. Bosses. They're like school teachers and parents, maybe less so parents these days, but their job is to keep me in line, to mark my work and tell me if I've been a good boy or girl. And if I get it wrong, they might fire me and I won't be able to feed my family or have that holiday. So I've got a real set of data and perception around risk and uncertainty when it comes to doing new things in front of the boss. So bosses, whatever level they're operating, have got a really interesting challenge. If they're going to encourage their people to create change, they have to give, re-give, and then double re-give permission and power, and keep inviting that conversation that says, is it safe? Is it safe? Is it safe? And it will take a long time for people to begin to initiate that conversation. And only when they have, and only when they're able to change their data because of the leader's behavior, often individually to them, and certainly in terms of the individual's actions, very little towards the leader's words, then that person will start to change. And if we're affecting change on a cultural level, but calling that and acknowledging that takes place on a cellular level of the organization, individuals, we have to be thinking, how do we facilitate people to change their rules?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, I think that grows out of experiences rather than statements. And I think that's really important to underscore that I think nowadays what we see is this huge gap between the talk and the walk, especially when it comes to empowerment and embracing this VUCA world and being adaptive and so on and so forth. So organizations talk a lot about that and the necessity for their team members and employees to be proactive and come up with ideas and be innovative. But then when people do, those ideas are shot down or criticized, and eventually the boss takes the decision. So as you say, it's really important to walk that talk. And it's really important, I think, to create those experiences for people so that they can as you say, eventually start establishing new beliefs, because we usually come up with new beliefs through experiences rather than someone telling us that it's a good thing to believe that it's safe now.
It's too high risk not to.
Yeah.
There are 3 types of harm that any human can come to. Physical harm, I get hurt. No, not relevant here. Not going to follow your algorithm. That's for a bungee jump or whatever. The second is my ability to feed myself and my family and be warm and sheltered. Security, harm to my security, to my cash flow. No, not initially damaged, could be in time. But third harm is harm to my reputation, my standing in the community, how you see me, and my own self-esteem and my own ego. And that we will protect. Surveys suggest that people are more afraid of giving a presentation than they are of death. So when that's how powerful that potential of being exposed to ridicule in front of our peers. So we're dealing with something very fragile that needs to be taken very seriously. And if the boss's actions aren't aligned in their schedule with the words, and their top team's actions aren't aligned in their schedules with the words, nobody's buying it. Cultural change is dead.
So let's make a hypothetical scenario here that you are working with a senior leader who grew up in the era where it was required for him or her to save the day and be the one to take the important decisions and craft a strategy that is going to help his company to win in the market. And now they sort of start realizing that times are changing, and therefore perhaps he or she needs to test his assumptions around how to lead people. But he struggles to do that. What would you advise this person to do specifically to expose himself to situations where he will be able to really evaluate that, whether this algorithm is the right algorithm for today, and if not, then what to start doing differently? What would be the first steps for him to take?
So that's a hugely complex question. We'll leave the strategy to one side. We'll leave platform and process to one side, and then just zoom into experimentation on how to lead culture differently through that evolution that you describe. And I would say that learning process will start in that individual's top team. So when a facilitator of high caliber team coach can come in and help them craft what is their common purpose, because whilst whatever's written on the wall, I've never met an exec team, I genuinely never met an exec team that was together, committed and coordinated to deliver a result, like an elite sports team would be. I've just never met it. So when we work together, we start exposing that through a mixture of work before they meet, individual work, and then bringing those concepts that we gather in research together to introduce them to in the room, what they are actually like and how they perceive they're operating with each other. We'll then work to produce a common objective that they're trying to achieve. It's like a sports team might want to win a certain competition, and from there we'll start putting in place the individual roles, and we'll start putting in place the culture required to hit the goal. Because what we can do is put culture in abstract. So we're all wandering around saying we're going to be honest, respectful, diverse, and customer-centric. And all of those concepts are superb. Are they, and all of them necessary, but are they relevant? And the primary cultural rules that we need to establish to hit a defined strategic objective, that it may or may not be tested. So how do we begin to do that? Some organizations you see doing that so beautifully and creatively, and others you just wince slightly at the hackneyed nature of what you're being shown. And so when we get that chief executive, I've worked in this scenario where chief executive officers are in tears, and they're tears of emotion, not distress. And these are, in the case I'm thinking of, was very senior and was male, for whatever that matters. And they were in tears of emotion because their whole team was saying that until you let us do our jobs and go off and do something more interesting, like lead the company and communicate with our top clients and be our greatest ambassador out in the media and all the things we would love you to do as a significant organization, we cannot move forward. And he found this so moving that he was being invited to rise up from being a micromanaging individual to having this platform, and so exciting, but also so scary. And he'd say, "What about this?" And his CFO would say, "Yeah, I had that in my last job. I had it in this job that you've taken it away from." And then marketing, what about this? He said, "Well, my friend, I'm an exceedingly experienced CMO. I've got that." So that shift started there in that room. The tears of emotion, the agreement. I could go on and talk about business that was won because he then chose to spend 2 days a week focusing on key accounts, and he had a massive impact on the key accounts. So he had a direct and immediate and significant impact on sales. And so that journey started there. From there, we can go on to how do I give that permission and share that experience onto my people. Now, not all chief executives or team leaders or country managers or regional leaders need to go through that process. They've been there perhaps. But to answer the scenario you presented, that's where I would start.
Mm-hmm. I think that the situation that you've described is a dream scenario for any facilitator or any consultant who's working with that team. But I think in the majority of the cases, what you are faced with is someone who really needs to do a lot of work to gain that level of self-awareness. When they can approach this with gratitude like he did. And what I find is that very often teams are not even willing to tell the truth to their boss about what it would take for them to be able to be successful, because exactly of that lack of psychological safety that you've mentioned before.
That's. I mean, there are two things there. One is that's sorry to cut in, but it's really important what you say. Partly that psychological safety must be created by the people who are coming in to support a team to go through this process. So that moment of tears is after 48 hours of extremely hard work, and it's not about tears. It doesn't have to be this emotional, but there's a lot of work in the room to create that goes on, and a lot of real honesty. And there's some terrifically honest feedback that gets generated. But all around, are you supporting the goal or not? So it's not personal. It's around behaviours for that. But secondly, it's not HR or culture change or you or me as people going in from outside. It's not our responsibility. So if there's an individual who is not going to create change, then eventually I'm going to move away from that and stop taking the buck and move on. Indeed, now if somebody invites me in to deliver change, but the CEO isn't in the room, the person who's been tasked with delivering change is in the room, I'll politely ask on the first time that we reschedule with the CEO in the room. If that's not an option, then that's the end of the conversation. It can't work like that. So there are some, I can't own that individual's difficulties, nor can the HR team. So eventually we have to move away from or come together and expel individuals of that nature.
Yeah. And of course, I imagine that when you are going through the journey with your team, it's really, really difficult. And in spite of best intentions, habits are really, really powerful. And so I see very often people with the best intentions trying to do the work the best they can, but habits have their pull, and very often they will bounce back to the old way of doing things when the first crisis happens. So I'm curious whether you have any ideas of how you can help leaders and their teams to be mindful of the commitments that they have made in terms of changing behaviors and changing culture and sticking to those commitments, even when, the shit hits the fan, basically, and things start being really difficult. Because this is very often the experience of a lot of teams that, yes, when things are easy and sort of planned and going according to the plan, then it's okay to be mindful of how we operate. But when things start being difficult, it's just really hard to stick to what you have committed to.
Well, we started with fear, and you brought fear up again, and fear will drive us back to behaving in type. And there is a motivating factor in change, which is to be fearful, because fear is a very positive emotion, by the way. I do fear failure. I do not embrace failure. Fear is a very positive emotion. And I think we misunderstand that. So this isn't about countering fear, and it's definitely not about being fearless. What a terrifying prospect. There's one neuroscience case I can find on fearlessness, a case called SM, Sierra Mike, and you can Google that. Where a woman's amygdala was eaten up by disease. Mm-hmm. It wasn't always comfortable output and the existence, and the fearlessness, in my view, was what established us into the 2007 global recession. So I'm not a big fan. I'm a big fan of fear, but knowing fear. So KNOW, know fear. This is part of our job now. So there will be a fear which will have us revert to type. There's also a fear of not changing and being in a better place in 12 months' time and repeating this. So there's an important Gartner. I spoke at an event for them recently, and they had a phrase that I hadn't heard called bimodal thinking. We have to be thinking in two modes constantly in our current age. One is a fast change, fast disruption. One is, are we okay in 12 months? And one is, have we got the lights on this month? And we have to be able to distinguish that. So the behaviors we're talking about are, how do we keep it all safe and in the best way we think we can, making a strategic bet in 12 months' time or 24 months' time. And what you're describing is how do I keep the lights on today because I've got an issue. So a weddedness, a real commitment to that objective in the future will facilitate people to bring up their colleagues back on track when the SH1T hits the fan, as you say. The second is keeping that external person in, and I'm not. This isn't pitching for consultants here, but they have a role, and one is to be the conscience of the room. So if we've agreed that we're going to start, and believe me, this happens in these meetings, we agree that all meetings will now start on time because we do a little calculation of how much time is wasted when they don't. And so even at that, keep it very simple at that level. If people aren't on time, we just remind people how much cash we just spent by having the chief executive plus 3 people sitting waiting. So we can have a conscience on more important issues even than that in the room with a long relationship. And we don't find sports coaches being dumped after the team's got a plan. We find sports coaches engaged with that team, and the CEO is not a coach.
Yeah. So how do you see CEO's role in evolving a culture?
They're the linchpin. And they very rarely have an appreciation of the enormity of their influence. And to do that, one can only go back to being a small child at school and looking at the headmaster. I don't mean to infantilize employees for one second. I'm just using a for instance. That when that person swished past, there were your whole metabolism would shift. Now, that's not the same at work, but I just want to bring us to that place because any people who are of a senior, it doesn't have to be CEO, senior rank, do not forget that. And so when we see you accept senior people behaving poorly around you, you're sending out the most enormous message. When we see you say people are my number one priority and fill your schedule, which I've got access to and I can see, and everyone knows what you're up to because you're the CEO, and I can see you spending your time in meetings related to spreadsheets, then I don't buy that people are your key priority. So the role, Hamlet, there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. He's speaking about Claudius, but he's also speaking about the state of Denmark. Sleeping Beauty, she falls asleep under a curse, but the whole kingdom falls asleep under a curse because the royal family is cursed. Now, the mythology and the spiritual energy around leadership transcends anything on the logical level that I was trying to describe a moment ago. It's much bigger. There is something rotten in the state of Denmark refers to both the king or the queen and the wider community.
Absolutely.
So
And,
they're the
yeah. And I think that you cannot not shape culture, particularly if you are in a formal leadership position. But I also believe that anyone really in any sort of social situation, they are shaping culture either consciously and intentionally or not. But it's not just the things that we do, but also the things that we don't do, as you say, that have an impact. And I think definitely the higher you are in the hierarchy, the more magnified that impact is, and the ripples are bigger, I believe.
I'm so with you. Wonderful, beautifully put. And once that clear objective is set for the future and the team have roles to deliver it, and they have agreed cultural rules, which can be, we've spoken about times, it could be, we no longer speak about anybody behind their back. We will only speak with any sort of degree of negative comment if the person is in the room. So we can change things. Now, once that's connected to the goal, which they really care about, the objective they care about, they'll hold each other to account to that. So you don't see decision-making by default because, well, why would I interfere with that? I'm busy, I've got a meeting. Actually, that becomes the primary thing I need to interfere with, because I don't believe, because I've gone through an intellectual process on this, I don't believe we're going to hit our objectives unless I'm guardian of that culture. And those cultural rules.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want us to shift gears a little bit and talk about a situation where, and because in your work, I know that you talk about the voices that we hear in our heads that tell us that things that we want to do, maybe they are not possible or not practical, and they will not work. And I know from experience working with people in organizations that they very often hear these voices in their own heads about the change that they want to lead. So it's terrifying. And of course, fear definitely shows up on many occasions. And I also think that there are a lot of voices that are real voices of their colleagues and sometimes even their bosses that say very real things like, this will never work here, or, things work just fine the way we've always done them. So thank you very much for your great ideas, but we don't need them. So I wondered, what are your thoughts on how to handle this kind of resistance from our colleagues, family members, from community members?
Individual voices or the community voice, or one after the other?
Well, let's start with individual voices, because I think one of the biggest frustrations that people share with me is that they've tried to do something that has been planned, and then there is resistance from the team, people saying, individuals saying, I don't think that this will work. We've tried this in the past and it didn't work, and just forget about it. So what do you do? And the assumption here, of course, is that it's just the so-called resistance to change. So how do you deal with that?
Well, first, I think resistance to change is generally a resistance to risk and uncertainty because we haven't been trained to do it. It's like, I will resist jumping in that helicopter without training. For good reason. So that I just sort of throw that out there. And then the voice is usually saying, I can't. And whether I can or I can't, and this was huge for me on horseback, and it was huge for me even daring to walk into a racing yard. Are you serious? Me walking into a racing yard? I can't ride horses. I'm unfit, and I'm about to get on a racehorse because I had to learn on racehorses and go off on the gallops. And then by the time I got to the racetrack, it was a really potent voice. So standing there in silk inside the changing room, really potent voice. And it's generally saying, you can't do this. You don't have the right to take this next step. So let's look at that. There are a number of ways we can look at this, but I'll just pick one up that I think is the most easy to understand and perhaps the most useful, which is that whether I can or cannot do something, whether something will or will not work, or whether I have the right to move forward in a certain direction, is not dictated by a voice in my head. And it isn't a feeling. it's going to be according to data. Now, that data might be uncertain at this stage, and I might need to share responsibility and accountability with a number of people before we choose to move forward and take risk, because the risk is increased because the data is less certain because we're in super early stages. But that's just surviving in a VUCA world and going through a life filled with adventure and growth, where we're going to try some things and some may not work out. But the voice in our head is not giving us a truthful answer. It is the manifestation of the fact that we are leaving or considering leaving the comfort zone. And if we leave the comfort zone, we're going to walk into what I call the confusion zone, which nobody talks about. We're all excited about leaving the comfort zone. Well, the confusion zone exists when somebody pulls the lever that kicks you off into the ocean at the beginning of a free dive for the first time, or when somebody puts you in the starting stalls at Southwell Racecourse on a racehorse with 14 other people for the first time, and horses. That now you're in the confusion zone. So you prepare for it carefully, and you have to ask: is it safe to take this next step? If it isn't, is it completely safe? Rarely. Is the downside acceptable?
Mm-hmm.
No, because I haven't spoken to the boss about it, and I could be about to create a car crash. So let's go and share this risk around. And is the risk worth the reward? And those three elements have to come into play, because I'm placing a degree of a bet always, because we're talking about uncertainty and risk, trying something new. So in order to deal with that internal voice, it's not a real voice. I have my fear algorithm, which is live and trying to take over my thinking cognitive functions and my body's physiology, going into a position which could eventually lead to a panic attack in a significant scenario, or for people with certain predispositions. And then I've got my purpose, my desire to test boundaries, move forward and create new things. And that purpose and fear algorithm are always going to be, to an extent, in conflict. But there are real considerations to take into account. So for me in the changing room, the question is, well, have I earned the right to walk out of the door? And the answer was, to cut the story short, I'd lost 25% of my body weight. I'd ridden for 3 hours every day before going to work. I'd done 5K every night. I'd stuck to an incredible diet. I'd been to the British Racing School in Newmarket, where they'd assessed me and given me a license. So yeah, this is a significantly high-risk situation, but I've earned the right to put my chips on the table.
This is what I really appreciate about your work, because you don't tell people, just tell the voices in your head to shut up, be bold and go for it and jump and the net will catch you. What you're saying is that you need to be prepared to speak back to those voices and say, I've done my work, I'm prepared for this. In fact, this phrase from Stephen Pressfield's book, The War of Art, has been my mantra as well for the past 5 years. Just do the work. And when in doubt, do more work. Right?
Yeah. I just played with rule 3, which used to be head in the direction of where you want to arrive every day, which actually I get, but it's not very hashtag. But I've just literally, without knowing the author you just mentioned, changed that to do the work.
Yeah.
And of course, the trouble with the work is there's no space in the schedule.
Yeah.
So that's why change doesn't have. We come on to another really important thing.
Totally.
Which I don't know if you want me to go on to now.
I do, but before we go there, I also would like you to speak to. So these are the voices in our heads, and basically what you're saying is the only way to really effectively deal with these voices is to do the work. And we'll talk in a bit how to create space to do the work. But I also want you to address the real voices. So the voices of your colleagues who are saying, this will not work. I don't want to do this. We are doing fine right now. Why should we go for more or different stuff? Do you have any advice for our listeners how to deal with that resistance coming from their team?
Absolutely. And with huge respect for the level of the challenge. So I'm not meaning to disregard that in any way by saying what I'd like to do is keep it very simple again. So human beings have either been driven at any moment in time by their purpose. There's something I want to do. I got out of bed this morning and I was driven by process. I turned on my kettle and I made caffeine. But by whatever time it was, I had managed to rescue purpose back, and I had my running shoes on and I'd hit the road, which was not really what I wanted to do at whatever time this morning, but it was done. We're being driven by either one or the other. When you listen to those voices come from other people, are they being driven by purpose or are they being driven by process? Are they telling you stories that support avoiding things they're worried about. They won't know that. They won't know that. But can you gently and kindly explore it? Where are they coming from? And let's go to data. That's interesting you say that. Why? And but we can't just walk in. I had a wonderful thing. I had a significant problem coming in an organization I worked for. We were bidding for a contract. It was an enormous contract to put an entire IT infrastructure into the Romanian railway system. This is going back a long time. The Romanian railways, I'm sure, have wonderful IT structure today, but this was shortly after the fall of Ceausescu, and so we had a significant problem coming with withholding tax, and without boring anybody who doesn't already know with the intricacies of withholding tax, it was going to be a serious issue. And I said we had a chief executive of our international division, and I was the legal person on the matter, and I said, surely we've got to engage. Make up a name for him, Harry. We've got to tell him. We've got to highlight this. And he said, "What? Just walk into Harry's office and just tell him?" I said, "Yeah, the guy needs the information." And they were more senior to me. They banned me from giving Harry the information. Contract was signed, and it went ahead with significant issues on withholding tax because there wasn't a way around it. So we'd explored with some really clever brains, how do we get around it? We couldn't. So the answer is probably to no bid, which was difficult given the level we'd gone to. I might have to put a blank over Ceausescu and Romania now. I've given it away. But so we can have. Now, I didn't test the data. I was too young.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't test the data. Why? Why don't we tell this gentleman that we have an issue coming?
Mm-hmm.
So test the data with people. Yeah. Where are they really coming from?
It's so simple when you think about this. Just talk to people and understand their concerns. But I find that very often people will say, "Yeah, but it's on and on and on, and I just don't have time to engage in this conversation." So I think this brings us back actually to this conversation about doing the work and finding the space for work. Because clearly, if we want different results, if we want less resistance, for example, we need to get off our bumps and invest some time to make this change happen. And I suspect that this is where the tiger roars the loudest. You talk about the tiger, the fear when it shows up. Because for a lot of people, they look at their calendar and they just say, and it's a very real concern, I just don't have the time to do this work. So they say, I don't have the time to do the daily huddle with my team, or I don't have the time to set up a system to identify opportunities and engage. I don't have the time to explore, blah, 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 blah. So what do you say to that? And how do you tackle that challenge? Because it's a real one. It's a real one for a lot of our listeners.
Completely. And I was in a car this week in Lisbon, and I was speaking to an international head. He and I had been on the same aircraft, and we were going to a hotel to address a meeting. And we were speaking about making space in this. He was making space in sales managers' diaries. So a wide and EMEA team for an extremely successful company, putting space into sales managers' diaries to coach and lead their team. And I said, well, just out of interest, what else is there in a sales manager's diary other than coaching and leading the team? Now you've asked the $1 million question. And he started listing off all the various carrier bags that this organization had demanded the sales managers carry about with them all day long, that absolutely prevented them driving sales performance. So we can, I think it's back down to what is the objective and how are we going to move? And this is why it has to come from the top. If the top is objective led, rather than turning the handles on a control mechanism from the industrial age that requires reporting, and everyone requires reporting, and everything must be reported on, and we're creating data now, we're able to analyze the data. So I'm not dismissing that at all. But if we're not fine-tuned to go win the competition we're trying to win, if we're just in a big corporate machine, then we have some degree of difficulty. Now that comes from the top. On an individual level, change is always going to happen in the calendar. And if I want to change my body shape and my life expectancy, that involves shifts in actions. And where do I put the actions? In the calendar. What's the trouble with the calendar? The calendar's full. So something has to go. Or I have to resign myself to the fact that in this particular moment in time, I cannot effect change. Either that's an okay situation and it's safe for my future, or it's not okay and it's not safe for my future. And I have to own that decision, action, result, and be accountable for that. The fear algorithm will always kick in along with a whole range of lovely narratives, because we don't like to admit it's fear. We've always got a reason and somebody to blame because we're human, we're crafty, we're clever.
I don't think that we even admit it to ourselves. We don't. We convince ourselves that the reasons are real.
Yeah, which is why this metacognition is so important, to be able to understand ourselves in order to create and effect change. But we have to be able to push things out of the diary. That may mean saying to a senior person, would it be okay if I don't come to this meeting? I've got a choice between achieving this or achieving that. I think it's more important in line with what we're trying to do. You can fill in the rest yourself. And people don't want to have that conversation, of course. And leaders, once you've set up a request, a demand perhaps for people to move in a certain direction, are you then preventing them by inventing different activities that they're being invited to get into?
Yeah. That's such an important point, Jim, and thanks for raising that, because I think that the calendar is a really, really important space for change, where change happens, especially when it comes to individuals, and people will really find a lot of excuses why they cannot stop doing things that they're doing. And again, I think, as you say, a huge part of that is driven by fear. One of the reasons is that we don't want to give away stuff that makes us feel important, for example. So as you say, ego plays a role, and we have a need to control. I find that a lot of managers do the things that they do, and they don't want to stop doing the things that they do because they are afraid that if they stop doing those things, they will lose control of their teams and what's happening in their department.
Yeah.
So again, goes back to our conversation about fear and how to tackle that, right?
Let's not shy away from the fact communities are incredibly complex things with many different internal and external factors influencing the behavior of the community, of the organism overall. But as leaders then looking at this, if we're setting a culture where it's okay to say, why am I in this meeting room? Anyone mind if I leave?
Absolutely.
Rather than sitting there for an hour, then that's coming from the top, and it's all objective driven. It's not I'm leaving because I want to go and sit and stare at Outlook and see what CC'd emails I can read. It's because I've got something really exciting to go contribute. Then we have a chance, I think, if that's coming from the top, of people feeling empowered, which is something I'd love to touch back on. Having the power, let's put it in a more powerful phrase. I'm bored of empowerment, it's devalued, but people knowing they have the power to say in a meeting and not be castigated for saying, I shouldn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's shift gears and move to our rapid fire questions section. This is a moment in the interview where I want to ask you 5 questions in rapid succession, and we'll aim at you answering these questions in under 2 minutes. Is that all right?
Okay.
Awesome.
I haven't seen them. This is going to be interesting.
And all of them are about culture. So how do you define organizational culture?
I'll go with the cliche, how we do things around here.
Okay. And what are the signs that a company culture doesn't work and needs some work?
Stressed people, people talking about mental health and resilience, and people not achieving personal or collective goals.
Are there any companies that you admire for their culture? And if yes, why?
Yeah, it's cliched again. I'm just bowled over by Netflix and what they've done.
And what books on culture or on leadership would you recommend to our listeners?
Oh, I'm going to plug Patty McCord from Netflix because I'm on a roll here.
Powerful. Okay. And what is one thing that our listeners can do today to act boldly and start cultivating a culture that helps them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
Be clear on objectives and think about how to give permission. Decide, if it's today, how to give permission. People need a lot more permission than we think.
Fantastic. So who would you recommend as the next guest on the podcast? Who's an interesting person to speak to about culture, about leadership, about overcoming obstacles that people face in creating great workplaces?
One of the most inspiring people I've worked with was a man called Gary Hoffman. I met him as CEO of Barclaycard. He went on to be invited by the British government when it took ownership of Northern Rock after a run on that bank in 2007. And he was faced with the most enormous cultural challenge, paralysis through fear, decision-making chains that went right up to the board and right the way back down. And then when he would ask for something to be done, he realized that 2 months later, people would so slowly crawl back out from under rocks where they'd hidden and said, "But how?" And there'd been a 2-month gap because they weren't supposed to ask how. It wasn't lack of desire. It was just a cultural horror at asking how. So I would really recommend talking to someone who's been in the hot seat and delivered, turn that thing around, which is Gary
I'd love to speak to him. Do you know him personally? You said you've been inspired by him, so I'm assuming that you've worked with him.
Well, I worked with him in Northern Rock, and we used Taming Tigers, and he also kindly contributed to my book Taming Tigers. So he has a case study in the book of the work that we did together at Northern Rock. I say we. Mine was a very small role.
Wonderful. It would be wonderful if you could connect us. Sounds like a great recommendation. Thank you so much. So is there anything that you'd like to leave our listeners with as a closing remark?
We're only here once.
As far as we know. Yeah.
All right. We're only here once. So we're going to be one day, aged 105, looking back, hopefully from a half-decent care home on this thing that we wanted, even from our own home, who knows? But looking back on this 105 years of writing our story, our decision, our action, our results, every single day, writing a story. And at that moment, will we look back and on 2019, when we had all this youth and energy and opportunity to make a tremendous impact in an incredibly thrilling world, and think, do you know what? I was led by purpose. I got the data. I challenged my own data, and I moved forward with a degree of risk and uncertainty that I found acceptable. Or when I say, well, I was run by process. I did what felt safe.
I love that. Thank you so much, Jim. It was great. I really enjoyed speaking to you, and I'm sure that some of our listeners will definitely want to learn more about you and about your work. So what would be the best places for them to reach out to you or find out more about your work?
Always really happy to connect personally, jim@jimlawless.com, or to stay in touch with each other through social media, LinkedIn, of course, also out there on Instagram and Twitter.
I'm Aga Bajer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast, and this is the Culture Lab team.
Production Manager, Lindsay Nunez.
Art Director, Emily Spencer.
Aaron Scott, Content Editor.
Sound Producer, James Eade, Be Heard.
If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, you can do it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and many other places where podcasts are available. If you'd like to subscribe to my newsletter, The Culture Lab Insider, go to www.agabajer.com/podcast and scroll down to the very bottom of the page. That's www.agabajer.com/podcast. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to it. And now, a quick preview of our next episode. In 2 weeks from now, you will hear me speak to Chris Westphal. Chris is a consultant to financial leaders and Fortune 100 companies. He's helped entrepreneurs to launch a broad array of businesses and successfully rebrand its products and services around the globe. Here is a short preview of our conversation where Chris talks about cultivating the culture of action.
You know, I look at the quote from Nelson Mandela from South Africa, who said, "It seems impossible until it's done." And the best leaders, the culture that's really effective, is a culture that's not trying to manage mindset or turn pessimists into optimists or the other way around. It's a culture of action that says, regardless of your psychology or your mood or your attitude, what are the actions that are going to create the change that's going to create progress?
Thank you for listening to this episode of Culture Lab. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share it with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared.